it's a pleasure to be back here at the New School, to be back in the discussant role, and especially today with my teacher, my mentor, and my friend, Rabbi Elliot Ginsburg. I want to introduce you, Elliot, for a moment, but then maybe we can dig right in with the nigun and some teaching,
Sure.
a little text study, and then just burst out in all directions from there. As I said in my Facebook post about today, I said, Reb Elliot's mind is a beautiful whirlwind. And I think you're all going to get a sense of that. Today, Reb Elliot is a professor of Jewish thought and mysticism at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and he's rabbi of the Pardes Hannah, which cleverly means something very close to Ann Arbor. Pardes Hannah, minyan in Ann Arbor. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, taught at Oberlin before coming to Michigan. He's received an NEH Fellowship and a Kellogg Foundation grant supporting his scholarship. Reb Elliot has written 2 books on the kabbalistic celebration of Shabbat, of the Sabbath, and he's currently working on a scholarly study of Jewish mystical prayer and meditation. He was ordained by Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi in 1998 and is senior faculty in the rabbinic ordination program of Aleph Alliance for Jewish Renewal, which is the program that I'm studying in, and God willing will receive my ordination in just a couple of months. Reb Elliot is the reason that I am in that program. I first had the opportunity to study with him at a retreat in 2004, and the impact of it was really so deep and the stimulation so intense that that Reb Elliot remained like very present in my mind and my spirit over the subsequent 10 years until I was at a decision point about going to rabbinical school. And one of my conditions for entering the program was that I would be allowed to have Reb Elliot as my academic advisor.
Oh.
So, Elliot, welcome.
Thank you, Irwin. I didn't know some of those things, so thank you.
Yeah, you did teach at Oberlin. It's true.
I did, and who knew?
And we're going to today be, you, Reb Elliot, are sort of a walking compendium of mystical texts and practices, and you're also kind of a polymath. Like when you talk about mysticism, you're also talking about music and art, and you have your fingers in many fields. And so really anything can happen today, and God willing, anything will happen today. Why don't I invite you, we were talking about maybe starting with that Rebbe Nachman Dveikes Nigen. And when I say something like Rebbe Nachman Dveikes Nigen, I need to pay attention to the fact that lots of people in this room would not be able to recognize those words. And so I'll do my best to stop so we can clarify. And if there are things we're talking about and we're starting to fall into jargon, feel free to put that into the chat. And Kira, feel free to jump in and stop us.
Beautiful. So I want to say, I know Irwin, you and I both spoke about this, that our learning today is really, we want to dedicate it to our beloved friend, Rabbi Sarah Tauber, who is in that liminal space, alive, but we don't know for how much longer. And a person of brilliance and promise and deep kindness and love. And so our soul, our hearts are connected to you, Sarah, at this time. May you be wrapped in light.
Sarah bat Perlasia v'Yosef Nachum.
Yes. Here is the nigun, or the wordless melody. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 Allah, ya, ra, 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 na, na, ay. Ay, 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 la, la, oh, 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 oh. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 Allah, ya, da, da, ya, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Oh, 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 oh. Ay, ay, ya, na, na, ya, na, 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 na. Ay, 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 Allah, ya, na, na. Ay, 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 ay. Oh, 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 oh. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 na, ya, na, 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 na. Ay, ay, anay, anay, anay. Ay, 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 anna.
Amen.
Sela.
So, Reb Elliot, maybe you can let's unpack what we just did. Tell us a little bit about the tradition of nigunim, where that comes from, and also that one is particularly, I think that one is a Dveikus nigun. So, tell us also what is Dveikus and what is that practice like?
Oh, it's a very rich question in a very few words. So dveikus comes from a Hebrew word of cleaving to, being connected to. In modern Hebrew, it even means to be glued to or velcroed to in some ways. And so it is a way of entering into loving communion with, in this case, with the divine. And so I often call it contact improv, as you know, because wherever you are, as the world shifts and our connection to the divine or to the ultimate shifts, we move and we try to find those points of connection. In some forms of dveikut, there is a kind of like velcroing. There's a sense of both the person and the other, the soul and the other, still having some kind of separate identity. Other times, there's a softening of one's boundaries. It's like a Venn diagram or mandorla, if you prefer that. And other times, there is a moving into the non-dual. And so we are like a wave in the ocean of the divine, or we are like a drop in the fountain of being.
How does the nigun practice move us into Dveikus?
Yes, that's a great question, because the way I often do it is you start with the self, and the self stretches and thins, and then you end up in a different place. And so it's a technique for transforming consciousness. Sometimes it is buoyed by longing. Sometimes it's you're already starting with some sense of deep connection there, and you are kind of plugging into it in a different way. Sometimes I feel that I'm being emptied. Other times I feel like I am being enlivened. I go from 110 to 220 volts or something like that. And so you sing your way there. And some of the veils and some of the armor comes off. And then when you return, again, some channels seem to have been opened.
What is the context in which you would do this? Are you waking up in the morning and singing a nigun?
Sometimes. And I do that, but I have to confess that sometimes I do that softly, and I think sometimes you have to really do it loud and with different dynamics for it to really open. You have to be able to vibrate at different frequencies and intensities. But I will do that as a transition when I'm entering into prayer, when I'm entering, sometimes into conversation, sometimes when I just want, when I am walking, I will do that sometimes. When I'm entering sometimes a home or a space, and sometimes when I'm leaving, I do it. I will walk through the rooms and sing. So.
How does this connect with, that was a nigun that's attributed to, or connected to in some way, Rebbe Nachman of Bratslav,
Right.
Who is the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, who we consider to be the founder of the modern Hasidic movement, which was really quite radical in its day,
Yes.
With its radical spiritual technologies. How does your walking through the house singing in nigun connect to Rebbe Nachman's idea of hitbodedut, if it does?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The word hitbodedut in Hebrew, maybe we could type it in.
I'm typing.
Yeah, wonderful. Yes, it means a being alone with, but it more generally is one of the key words in Hebrew for a kind of a meditative practice. And so Nachman would go to the forest very often, or to a meadow, or to some place and pour his heart out in the vernacular, which for him was Yiddish. And he said, though, that if you couldn't go outside, doing it in a room is also a way of doing it. And I when I sometimes do it in a room, I feel, it's funny, but I feel I connect with some of the memories, the energies of the room where I've been. So there is something of the context, the immediate surrounding, and some of the thoughts and memories that I have, but that enter into the song.
When you say thoughts and memories, is that what you're identifying as the energies in the room, or are you speaking about something more extrinsic to you and more in divine realms?
Yeah, it's both. Sometimes it's just being aware of the life that's unfolded in the room, right? It could be an awareness, just a fleeting one, of the other people who may have lived there and passed through, of the people who may have been involved in working in the more than human realm of other creatures that might have been part of that, and in fact are still there in the room, unbeknownst to me most of the time. So there's an awareness sometimes of that, bringing that in to the song. But sometimes if it's I'm thinking right now of something very specific, like the last time I was in my parents' house after they had passed and we had sold it, and I was saying goodbye. And so at that moment, there was a way that I just wanted to kiss the walls as I was singing. And so the entire house became a kind of mezuzah, became a mezuzah that object in which sacred scripture is written, and it reminds us of to be aware of the divine as we come and as we go in all our postures. And I felt that, mezuzah in Hebrew actually comes from a word of moving, lazuz, but it's like what moves you, and what moves through you. And I felt, and it's often at the limit, at the threshold, when you go from going inside and outside and the connection between them. And I felt like that was the last time I was going to be in that house in that way. And I had to acknowledge that. I had to be with it, and in ways that I couldn't fully fathom. And so it was tied in with my parents and their passing, and the wonderful new family that was moving in there. It was going to be their home. So, yeah. So that went into that niggin that time. That's unusual. That's much more freighted than it sometimes is.
Rebbe Nachman of Bratslav, whose nigun, whose wordless melody that was, was very much about the aliveness all around us. And we have a text. We have a little text that we can study as a community this morning, and I'm wondering if we might want to move to that and just see the directions that shoots us off into.
Yeah. Yeah, can I just say one more thing?
Please.
Because of course, it's like right after therapy that all the thoughts come to you when you've left. Yeah, so when Nachman sings a nigun, and sometimes when it's working for me, it's like you are. I think I said you're going through different levels of consciousness. You're going through different worlds. You're trying to access worlds other than what you would ordinarily be aware of in ordinary discursive consciousness. And so it's there's a way in which you for a while you become aware that we are, to use the phraseology of our beloved Reb Zalman, one of our teachers, one of our great teachers, who said, imagine yourself or feel yourself to be a cell of the living earth, right? And that's a different way of being in the world. And it's one of the ways. It's not the only way, right? But there's something fundamental there that we need to remember. And sometimes these songs are technologies that allow us to move through worlds of relation, worlds of big mind, worlds of where we're not the center of the universe, but we're part of this great symphony, cacophony.
Which is, again, the exact lead up to this text, this very famous text by Rebbe Nachman, which is about music and about not being centered as a human being, but being aware of the music in all living and inanimate things, the music of creation. So I'm wondering, Kira, if you could throw that document up on the screen share. And Reb Elliot, I'll just hand it over to you to teach this, however you would like.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So thank you, Irwin. And I have to say, Irwin, it's a fagnigan. It is a joy to be talking with you. I'm just really, really feeling so grateful. So this is so just to remind people when Nachman lived. He was born in 1772 and died in 1810. He was only 38 when he died of tuberculosis, and he lived in Ukraine. And so this comes from one of the major collections of his teachings, And so I say, before there was Whitman, there was Nachman. We call it the Song of the Grass here, Shirat Asavim in Hebrew. And I think just the only thing to say to set up for this is that Nachman both used musical practice and I would say the metaphor of music to talk about the interrelationship between all life. So that we're going to see in a minute, he's going to be talking about a nigun, a melody, and he believed that that everyone, all beings, have sparks of the divine within them. And one of the words that he used for spark, besides nitzot, is nikuda, which literally means a point. And for Nachman, following on other earlier mystical sources, he saw that nikuda, those points within us, those sparks within us, as vowels. They could be articulated as sounds. They also musical notes. That's one of the meanings of nikuda, is a musical note. So that spark of holiness within us is also some kind of open sound, like a vowel, and it's also a musical note. And within us, we each have our song. We each have a song within us that may be shifting, or maybe it's a core melody that we keep coming back to. And what does that mean? It means it's a vibration. It's a series of vibrations that bring us in alignment with what he calls a symphony of sound. He talks about prayer being like walking through a field of flowers. And every word is another flower, but every word is also another cluster of notes. And what we are doing is either fashioning a bouquet that we lift up to the divine beloved, or it is the song that we are singing. So that's a little bit of a background there, and now we'll jump in. He says, no. He always starts with no. And Irwin, I think it was you who said, you know, he's probably also thinking a little bit in Ukrainian or Russian. So da, yes, right, in Russian. So da, no, know deeply, know cellularly that every wisdom has a melody of its own. It has its unique qualities, vibrations, worlds that are contained in those melodies. Each wisdom according to its nature and level. And from this level to level up to the very point of creation. So Nachman has this unusual teaching that usually you think that music brings you to the threshold of silence, right? And Nachman had a little twist on that. He says, music and language brings us to the threshold of silence, but beyond the silence, there is music for him. It is the music of Ein Sof, of the infinite. He thought of it as a kind of texture of music. He says, there is a melody that comes through nature, of the sort alluded to in the Psalm, Hashemayim Misaprim Kvod El, the heavens tell of God's glory, the sky tells of God's handiwork. So we can understand that visually, but we can also understand it acoustically and in a certain way on the body, in a tactile kind of way, like being sung. And then he says, indeed, that there's a new, we always have to open to the new melody that's being sung through us, the Shir Chadash, the new song, the song of songs, the song that awakens other songs. And then I love this part here. He says, and when our ancestor Jacob sent his 10 sons to Joseph, who was in Egypt at the time, he sent a tune from the land of Israel along with them. Here we get into the words, the word play that is so typical of these Hebrew texts, which the way I would put it, to stay with the musical metaphor, is that each word has multiple levels of meaning. So a single note is sounded, but in your mind you hear chords. You hear chords. You hear the resonances. And so we're gonna see this in a second. And that is the meaning behind his words, that is Jacob's words. Take of the choice fruits of the land in your vessels. Chu mizimrat haaretz bichlechem. So in the original context, what does that mean? It means bring him a gift. Bring him something of the bounty of the land. Zimrat haaretz. But zimra, which is probably related in a word to the word pruning in Hebrew, it's kind of the choicest, like you're making certain choices, what to bring the choicest, but it is a homonym in Hebrew for song. As Rashi explained, read zimra in the sense of song. So how is Nachman reading it? Take something of the melody, the music of the land, in your vessels. Bring that melody which is uniquely yours. So even the fruit here, on some level, if we want to stay with the notion of the fruit, has its own vibration. It has its own song. How would we put it probably in Santa Rosa, a terroir or something like that? It's like, yeah, right. The microclimate of the vineyard, right? And something of the soil and the clouds and the fog and all of that gives the grapes a kind of unique quality. In the same way here, the fruits of the land, right? Of that has a kind of unique melody. Bring that melody with you. And this is really tied into the notion that every being has a unique nigun. And if we listen very carefully, we can hear that nigun, we can help draw it out. I'll say a little bit more about weaving it together in a minute. Then he goes on he talked about shepherds a lot. And for lots of reasons, it's all around him in where he was living, shepherds, and there's a way in which each of us is a kind of shepherd. What does that mean? For every shepherd has their own special tune according to the grass and the place of the pasture, right? So every blade of grass, or every patch of grass, if you want to be less fine about it, right, has its own kind of melody, its own terroir, if you will. And every animal has its own special grass that it needs to eat. And that is what determines the tune. So what is the tune that we are singing? What is it that we are taking in? What about the relationships we have, the vitamins and toxins that we take in? How do we work with that? What is the melody that we are singing here? He says, every blade of grass sings a song of praise. And from the song of all the grasses, the shepherd's tune is made. Let's stop here for a second and just say, how is it that we access the melody of the land, right? How do we listen? What is the earth crying out and saying something to us? How do we access that melody? Now, one of the ways might be through eating here. And in other places, Nachman talks about that, about in terms of what you're eating at the time, and how he's thinking maybe about meat or something here, but it could be fruit, and you can think of all of the melodies that from the rain, from the earth, from the blades of grass, from the earthworms, everything that the tree, everything that came in, the sunlight, of course, that came into that fruit. And how do we incorporate it? How does it alter us? right? How does it enter into our languaging and our prayers and our relationships? So you could eat it, but you also can access it via listening, right? And that's what he's doing. He's weaving together the songs of the grasses, and that's the prayer that he's taking and offering up. He's lifting it up. He's giving it back to the source of all life. And so it. I'll read another paragraph and then I'll say a little more and stop. If it were granted to you to hear the sounds of the songs and hymns of the grass, how each blade sings without pniya, it says in Hebrew, without ulterior motive or extraneous thought, without expectation of any reward, just being there, you would know how lovely and fair their song is, and how good it is to worship the Holy One truly among them. So here I'm going to note something about the quality of attention, because sometimes we can have one-pointed attentiveness, where in some ways we are letting the attention rest preferentially on, say, the breath, right? And other things are largely being shut out, or you can be more panoramic and weave in the sounds. Here he would go to the into the meadow or the forest and weave in the song of the bird and of the grasses. And it's as though that the world is praying for Nachman. So what else do I want to say? I want to say that this couple of associations that I have with this here. Nachman elsewhere in one of his teachings talks about a prayer leader. Or you can think someone who serves the community, but a prayer leader, he says that a prayer leader is someone who can hear the good points. Remember, the word point means melody, can hear the inner melody that the people in the community or the congregation have, and somehow weave in those different sounds. And I want to say it's good for us to take turns in that role, because we can each hear those sounds differently and help draw them out differently. And you know, and you have to wish other people well, Nachman says, and even wish yourself well, he says, in order to really to hear that melody, to hear the inner melody and lift it up. Another couple things just want to say is that when Abraham Joshua Heschel marched in Selma, Alabama, along with John Lewis and Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and nuns and a whole array of people across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that it was said that he marched with a Hasidic niggin in his heart. And so there, I think the melody is that which connects you to the source, that which helps you not to be seized by fear, and that connects you to what really matters. It was that connection, which was a soul connection, which was a song connection, and so I think of that as well. And so there's a song not just of the meadow, but of cities and of broken places and vital and varied places. It's in so many ways.
Reb Elliot, there's a place where I, especially as we're reminding ourselves of ourselves as political beings as well, I'm thinking about the polarization that we're experiencing in this country, in this world, that it's not hard for me to feel compassion towards the tree in front of my house, and and to feel identification with it. And it is very hard for me to feel compassion towards somebody on the other side of the political spectrum. And Rabbi Nachman, is very much about finding that nikudah, finding that spark of holiness in each person, hearing that melody, and weaving that together. That's what makes prayer, and that's what opens the gates. And How do you think, what was his thought, or what's your thought about how we hold those with whom we disagree virulently, and about the fate of the world? How do we hold in compassion, and do we hold in compassion?
That's one of the questions, and that's the practice, and that's why we say practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes practice. And I struggle with that mightily. And I mean, I know everyone has a story and a context. I do believe that, and I remind myself sometimes of the practice of seeing the divine spirit, what I call the divine spirit. I use God language to talk about these things, and that I see whether you want to call it the image of the divine, or the spark of the divine, or the animating force of the divine, that it's even in those who wish me ill, even in those with whom I stand in opposition much of the time. There is some recognition that we are co-inhabitants of this planet. I have to say that is something that I come back to. Am I someone, for example, who can, wish well to enemies and people I think are very, very dangerous? I find that hard. I try doing that sometimes. I do. I'm not always very good at it, and so these are, so sometimes I have a little practice. It's maybe a little too hard to explain right now, about seeing the Aleph, the letter Aleph, in which means the one, the divine, in every person's face. It's a kind of strange micrography that in every being's face, and I can do it with cats, but I can't do it with mosquitoes. And it's very hard to do with people who I think who have power, who are leading us in a very, very dangerous way. So I can wish them well, but I also, in some ways, will come up to resist some of the definitions and expectations that they have. I'll just give one last. This is just a pointing out instruction for me, So there is. I'm going to have to put this in the chat here, or maybe you can do it, Irwin.
Mm-hmm, sure.
There is an expression in Hebrew, Rav Shalom, and Rav means great is peace. Rav, R-A-V in English, great is peace. And a early 20th century mystic by the name of Abraham Isaac Cook said, "Don't think that shalom, peace, well-being, is where everything is of the same hue, of the same color." He says it admits of difference and diversity, and he says he learns that from the word Rav itself, Rav, which means great. He says Rav is related in some ways to the word in Hebrew Riv, which means argument. In other words, many different opinions. And he says that peace somehow can't be whole unless it finds a way to accommodate a multiplicity of co-creators, a multiplicity of viewpoints, and fashioning that into a whole where different people have a certain place. And I understand what that means when we're all sort of on the same page, right? And it's very, very hard to do that when the vessel of peace that we're creating seems to be sometimes shattered by opposing forces coming in. So I it's something he says. The word Rav also means teacher in Hebrew. So a teacher, according to Abraham Isaac Cook, is someone who can hold that diversity and that multiplicity and yet fashion it into some kind of whole, because he was a mystic too.
This conversation is sparking a lot of activity in the chat that I just just want to bring into the room. That
awesome.
Yael Weisberg is interpreting around the looking for the letter Aleph in one's face and using that as a reminder to see the divine. Bruce is asking sort of the obvious question that this all leads to is can you find a spark of the divine in a Hitler? Which is where this question always ultimately
always goes there.
it goes there and it has to go there. Leah Bowden from Rohnert Park says, from my congregation, says, I found it focusing on the thought that at some point in the other person's life, there was one person to whom some person they had previously helped. Or imagine them as a precious baby or a child. From the time they were loved. Yes. Ross Andelman from Vancouver is saying, yesterday in their study, one of the teachers says that in encountering bad road behavior, he yells out the window, "Tzaddik, tzaddik," which means the righteous one, saint, right? Saint. That's awesome. Attempting to convince the other as well as himself. I'm going to toss one into the mix too, is that spiritual activist and friend of Commonweal, Caroline Casey, has a blessing practice. She has an elaborate and imaginative blessing practice. And her blessing practice is that you offer your adversaries a blessing that would help address like what the issue that you're spotting in them is, but as a blessing that you would also be happy to receive, right? Because you don't want to issue a curse because lest it bounce back at you. Absolutely. You don't want to put that into the world. So, for instance, she might look at the head of the EPA or the president and say, may he be blessed to wake up tomorrow morning and the angels show him the world with new eyes and he feels a love for the planet Earth.
Yes.
Right? And so
absolutely.
It's not about convincing, it's not about winning, and it's not about adversariality. It's about putting blessing into the world for something that we could all benefit from.
Yep. That's gorgeous. All of those, and I love, also yelling out "Tzaddik, Tzaddik," a righteous one. That's beautiful, and wishing that on others. And I mean, I have a picture of baby Hitler, and I look at it sometimes, and I have to say, it took me a long time, in the case of Hitler, to read a biography of Hitler. As you know, Irwin, my family was deeply affected by the Holocaust, and grew up with our grandparents, et cetera, and so feeling, understanding some of the twists and turns in Hitler's life and his relationship with his father and all that was hard. I finally got to the place I could do it. I also think of one of my favorite books by Stephen Mitchell, Meetings with the Archangel. And one of the practices that the protagonist teacher gives him is to send metta, to send well-being and love and compassion to Hitler. And he does that practice over a year, right? And has all sorts of ways of gradually getting to that point. But I love the notion that I can't remember the name of the teacher that you just mentioned.
Caroline Casey.
Caroline Casey. That is spectacular. That's spectacular because it doesn't sap you at the same time as you you look, Nachman always talks about looking at the good and holding a mirror up to the other where they can see the good.
Bruce in the chat is raising a question about spiritual bypassing that I want to perhaps expand and make it a little bit bigger, not just about this particular practice that we're talking about, but about mystical practice overall, which is, there's. I suspect that most of the people in this room are here because they're interested in mystical experience, or they have meditative practices or mystical practices of some sort that they devote actual time in their life to achieving some kind of oneness, to losing some sense of the limits of self, etc. And there's a question, in a world of action, are we throwing away our time? In other words, are we somehow stepping away from the troubles of the world and the action that's being demanded of us on this planet in this moment by doing this inner outer work of mystical practice?
So are you asking me?
I'm asking you.
Oh, okay. It is all related, and so I think to keep having points you can come back to, to rebalance, to hold a large view of seeing the divine in the other, coming with I'd say this kind of sense of connectedness, and what I would say using the nigun to connect is, to me, really, really important, and it is it's all part of the same practice, it seems to me. Of flowing in and flowing out, right? And admittedly, that there are times, another Heschel story, that one at the end of a long Shabbat, Sabbath, in about 1967 or so, there's a knock on the door at Abraham Joshua Heschel's home in the Upper West Side of New York. And there was a couple students over, Mrs. Heschel, and who's at the door but William Sloane Coffin, the great activist Episcopal priest, and Martin Luther King. And they had just spent a couple hours in jail in some civil disobedience, protesting the war, and they said, they were released, and they said, okay, let's go visit our friend Heschel. And Heschel says, you're just in time for the last bits of Shabbos before we make Havdalah. He says, Shabbos, and the day on which we uncouple ourselves from our enmeshments in the world, right? And to experience another, something else. He didn't do it that didactically, but you get the idea. And he says, the world that so needs healing. So sometimes we need to step back. We need to kind of rebalance and imagine what is possible, and to live out, in some ways, a life as though the world were redeemed. Be the world you want to see, something, so that when you flow back, you can do it with different possibilities. And I think that to me is, we have to find those practices that allow us to do that. I have a long teaching on that, but it's probably too complicated with Hebrew.
So tell us a little bit about Shabbat as a spiritual and mystical practice, and also how people who don't come from a Jewish context might be able to employ some of the Shabbat concept in a different way in their lives.
Yes, that's a great question. A great question. So I would say that it is a day 25 hours, 26 hours, however long, in a traditional sense, of living as though you were already redeemed. And it's, okay, I'll say it's a practice at that. We're not always at that place, and that means sometimes it's going to set you up for being upset if you're not at that place. So that's but there is there's a different way of eating, a different way of walking. Like you might walk more slowly on that day. You might have you live as though you were loved. Right? And from the place of feeling loved, you turn to others in love. And that, the notion of Shabbat being tied to a sense of well-being and love is very, very important. No matter really what kind of... there's a way in which you are ideally not measured by how much money you make, and how successful you are in the world of consumerism, et cetera, et cetera. But there's
the distinction that Reb Zalman talks about is the distinction between commodity time,
yes,
and organic time.
Exactly.
Right? That commodity time, how the way we measure our lives in chunks of time during the week. And time is money. Time has value. So when if I'm meditating, I'm not postcarding, and if I'm not reading my emails, that time is very much about what you can fit into it.
That's right.
And on a Shabbat, as the way Reb Zalman would experience it, and the way on our very best Shabbatot, on our very best Sabbaths, we experience it. Right. Is that it unfolds at its own pace. And we get to experience what it is like for time to unfold unpressured by our own needs and desires and exigencies. And it unfolds very slowly. Like the flow of time on Shabbat is completely different from weekdays.
Yes. That's so beautiful. And and another way that I like to look at it is stepping out of the river of more, M-O-R-E, and of the compulsion that some of us have to acquire more, to be more, which comes from, of course, a sense of not having enough. So it's another way of looking at living from a sense of enoughness, and so what are some of the practices? Deep rest, which doesn't mean necessarily doing nothing, right? It's a certain kind of sociability. It's a certain way of living more in harmony, less intrusive ways with the natural world. It is, blessing people and receiving blessings. That to bless another is to feel the blessing coming through you, to wish another well, in that way, to really imagine another way of being and practice it. And so that's, I think for some of us, for people who want to try it, I would say maybe unplugging is
everybody close your computers right now.
Yeah, which is impossible.
Steal this book.
Which is impossible now. Right. Which is, none of these things I would say are it's very hard to make I won't make these as an absolute, right? Reb Zalman used to say, if you wore a 3-piece suit during the week, on Shabbos, wear jeans and a shirt or a top, right? If you wore ripped jeans and the shmata, some kind of shirt on Shabbos, you might want to get tzipitzel, or you might want to get dressed up a little bit, right? And so there's some different way of
Change of habit.
manifesting. I'm sorry.
Change of habit.
Change of habit. Yeah.
Aglecha. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Because we go on autopilot so often. Yeah.
Deep breath for a moment. I think I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to go in a little bit of a different direction. We've talked now about sort of mindfulness, certain kinds of mindfulness practice, about being aware of the animate world around us, the song that's in all life, in all creation. We've talked about sort of the terroir of that, which is a kind of which leads us to mindful eating, for instance, that when we make a blessing over food or before we take a bite, even if there's no spoken blessing, to have an awareness of the material that makes up this sandwich and the sunshine and the water and the earthworms that made it possible, and all of the labor that made it possible. We've talked about Shabbat, taking time out of time. Taking time that's organic, taking time that's not about more. I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to take a little walk into Zohar. Zohar is a significant Jewish mystical text. It's probably the mystical text that most people in the world have heard of, Jewish mystical text that people have heard of. And give us a sense of what Zohar looks like and what kinds of mystical learnings, without having access to all of that crazy Aramaic, but just from the model of Zohar, what kinds of mystical learnings might we be able to draw into our own lives?
Yes, I will do that. Can I just say one more thing about Shabbat? I promise I'll make a segue. Okay, because this is lots of the ideas come to me afterwards. I said, and that is Shabbat is the day of the deep breath, right? And this is a teaching of Nachman of Bratslav, that there is the Jewish tradition of having a more expansive soul on Shabbat, or a part of the soul that's crumpled up during the week can unfold. We can be more vulnerable and open, or something from the divine tree of life, our other part of our soul that we can't access it enters us and we are enlarged. But so it's called Neshama Yetera, the additional soul. But not surprisingly, the word neshama, it also means soul breath. And yetera means an abundance of. So Nachman reads Shabbat as the day of the deep breath. And it's the deep breath that you take that goes into the asphyxiated parts of your soul, right? And so if you've been holding your breath, clenching it, you have to unclench, and so you are breathing in deeply, and you Nachman says, think of the places in your body, in your soul body that are tight, that are cracked, that are asphyxiated, and he says, breathe in deeply. And then sigh softly into those places that need the healing breath. And I do that, and I expand it to think about what is awry in the world of my intimate relations, and I sigh into that, sending healing breath, and into the body politic, into our world. Into the planet, and even divinity, right? And that both encompasses and suffuses our world. And I think that is a Shabbat practice for me, in some ways, to do that with the understanding, as the mystics teach and as Reb Zalman teaches, that there are moments of Shabbat every day of the week. And so we have these big practices that teach us how to bring them into the everyday. Okay.
I'm wondering if
Now we can go to Zohar.
before we move to Zohar, if we can just take a moment for people to do that.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Yeah. So take a couple of cleansing breaths. Breathe in deeply and breathe out. And do that a couple of times. And you might want to, if you're sitting down, just feel your body and your shoulders and feel yourself your head being suspended by a thin thread of grace, of chut of chesed from above you. And so take a moment and see, where are the cracks and the crumpled places and the spiritual knots that are in us right now. And just breathe in deeply. Then exhale, softly sighing, sending the healing breath into that place. Let's try it again. We'll do it 3 times. Deep breath in. And softly sigh out. And then just a little bit of an imaginal exercise for the 3rd time. Think of just 1 or 2 things where there's some crack in our larger world. And hold it in your mind's eye. Breathe in deeply and sigh the healing breath into that place as a kind of prayer and wish. And I'll just say that in Hebrew, the lengthening of the breath, Nachman calls it he relates it to the word in Hebrew, which means the long nose, in Hebrew, which means patience. So it is the deep breath of patience that where we move from reaction and reactivity to more of a thoughtful response and wishing well. And yes, it is not unlike a Tonglen practice, and Nachman has something that's even more similar to a Tonglen practice. But yeah, beautiful, yeah, the long nose patience. Yes, it's erech apayim, and yeah,
which Jews in the room might recognize from the 13 attributes that we chant on the High Holy Days coming up, and also in this month leading up to the High Holy Days. Erech Apayim.
Yeah, here, send that to everyone there. All panelists and attendees. Right. So, but literally the long nose, it's like the deep breath there. Yes. And yes, it and there are practices that I think are, you have, that really are practices, that Nachman does of taking in some of the suffering of the world into oneself and then breathing that out. That which is much like a Tonglen practice. That's hard. That's hard. Yeah.
I'd like to contain my immense Zohar question.
Okay.
And ask if you can tell us specifically about what are the mystical catalysts that seem to be suggested in Zohar through the frame story of the Chevraya. We have already talked about breath, rest, and being in nature and speaking in nature. What are the other suggestions that seem to come up in Zohar's internal stories?
I'd say the sense that the world is layered, that there are mysteries that can unfold, that divinity is a dynamic, multifaceted presence that itself has a story that is evolving, that emerges from a still center. So it holds both tremendous diversity, the oneness that is an interweaving of being, call it the Sephirot, those energy centers within the divine. They get gendered and have all kinds of interesting qualities, but that underlying it in the deepest structure is the sense of the infinite, which is beyond the differentiation and the gendering. And there's a movement, there's an unfolding from the divine no thing to the divine self. It's a word play in Hebrew, from ayin, which means the no thing, right, to ani, the self. Okay, in Hebrew, it's the same letters, it's just rearranging the letters in Hebrew and rearranging consciousness. So in the Zohar, what is it that triggers the sense of this multi-leveled experience where you can shift consciousness and hold multiple kinds of consciousness? One thing is to realize that life is a kind of spiritual adventure, that there's always room for surprise through looking with new eyes, sometimes being playful. They're very playful with sacred text. And there's also a way in which the Zohar can be quite embodied. And so I'll reflect a little bit on that give you an example of, for Shabbat, entering Shabbat and seeing divinity as a rose, for example, as a rose. There's a way that when you smell the rose, and the rose itself is a kind of, is a manifestation of the divine energy that is congealed into this particular form. The stem of the rose and its roots are rooted in Ein Sof. It's like you have to think of an upside down rose now, and the petals of the rose are different qualities of compassion of the divine. To smell that rose is to and to participate in something of the divine presence and the divine mystery, to take that into you. Another example. Here's one. There's one where one of the things that's interesting about the Zohar is that it's a kind of social form of mysticism. Okay, and that there's a group of companions that bump up against all kinds of tricksters and sometimes birds that teach them things and innkeepers and et cetera, et cetera. And they walk often on the way, on the untrod path along the road in meadows and so on and so forth. Or sometimes they get up at midnight and study, right? And they're coming out of sleep in a more liquid state, and they get together, they open up verses of scripture, they riff on those like it's jazz with each other, and so they enter different realms of consciousness, but they're talking to each other. So it's like, that's why I think of like a jazz ensemble in some ways, where they riff off of the the verse or the head of the song, and they're so anyhow they're there's one where they're walking along the way and they come upon an oasis, and there's this beautiful tree and with fruit on it, and there's a kind of there's a pond or actually a wellspring, and they stop and they enjoy it, and then they come up with they think of a verse from Song of Songs, thinking about a wellspring of living water and streams that are coming from Lebanon, and they see that spot where they are as an emblem of the divine. The divine is manifest in our world as that wellspring, as that as the tree, and it's experienced as a kind of gift, and they start smelling roses all around, and yeah. I'm sorry.
So sort of, translating to us, it's again about sort of having this, what we might call mochin de gadlut, this heightened consciousness that, you can smell a rose and it's just a smell, or you can smell a rose and it's a portal.
Right.
And how do we allow ourselves to have more portals?
Oh, yeah. I'm just thinking right now, in the Zohar, there's a place where in order to enter into this cave, right, this cave of kind of Edenic consciousness, that they smell a rose, and the rose opens the gate, and then at the end of the journey, you know what they do? They smell an apple, and the apple encodes the deep memory within them. Isn't that interesting?
Why an apple?
Well, what I was thinking of, in some ways, they entered into some Edenic realm. And so I think they're taking something of the fragrance of Eden and the memory of it with them, thinking, the Eden story. And so there's a way of, how do we nurture the glimpses? That's a question Shefa Gold, always, my friend and teacher, always likes to ask. How do we kind of encode and incorporate in us some of those mochin de gadlut, those expanded consciousness moments? How do we bring that into everyday life? Yeah, how do we remember it, make it part of us?
And you, Reb Elliot, what advice do you have to offer on how do we do that? How do we integrate nirvana?
Oh, one thing is, I think, have friends on the path that can help keep that alive for you, for one. Another is to find sacred teachings and teachers, companions on the way, and teachers where you can access those moments. If you're an extroverted thinker, as I think I might be, at least some of the time, right? We spark each other in that way, and there's a way we can also check in with each other. Which I think is to reflect on where we've been. Another way is to journal, to write. But aligning yourself with some practice that's bigger than you, that's deep. And, it could be for some a Buddhist path, for some it's a Jewish path, for some it might even be some holy amalgam, but to I think not just do what the heart desires when you desire it. There's something about aligning yourself with a path of wisdom, which also has its traps, don't get me wrong, but that, Reb Zalman taught that when you align yourself with a larger system of meaning, that miracles can happen, something can unfold. So, having a steady practice, I think, is sometimes it's seasonal, sometimes it is daily, sometimes it's weekly, and things happen on a different scale. And we need different vitamins. Minimum daily spiritual requirement, minimum weekly, monthly, yearly requirements. And
folks in the chat are very excited about being holy amalgams.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you're talking about there in this last bit is about how do we live in more than one world at once in the sort of Jewish mystical sense of the four worlds. How do you have your feet in this world of action, but also be open to spiritual energies, be aware of the flow of wisdom and thought in the universe, and also how the divine illuminates all of it. And you can't be aware of all of that at once for very long.
No,
if ever.
Right.
But friends along the path, every time you see a rose, having the holy reminders.
A blessing practice is very important.
Blessing practice, dream practice as well.
Yes.
An awareness that in our dreams we move into a different world, and then we try to bring those dreams back with us.
Right.
These are all ways to sort of keep ourselves not just trapped in this physical world of biology and politics, but to also be able to see and problem solve from other levels.
Yes, totally right about problem solving from other levels. Sometimes I feel this is from the world of prayer, but I think it's from the world of problem solving too. It's that in healing, there's a sense that you go up one world higher and bring the energy down. In other words, if from a problem-solving perspective, we are just within the frame of the way things have been defined, it's blinkered. And so I agree that seeing it from the world from a different perspective, having, I think is incredibly important.
I'm aware of time, and I want to ask you something personal. We've been flying to all sorts of high places today. I want to ask you something tachlis, something very just sort of practical and personal, which is you teach at a university, you teach Jewish studies, so right, which comes out of this Wissenschaft, this tradition of looking at Judaism at arm's length, right? Being able to describe movements and texts in historical contexts and as part of schools of thought. And you are also a practitioner. And my question for you is, how do you bridge that? Which came first, if there was a sequentiality? How do you how did you move into having actual practices, and how do they infuse your life?
Wow. In 3 minutes, right? Okay.
You get 6.
6. Okay.
Twice as much time as you thought.
It's expansive. So first there's a mountain, then there is no mountain. No. Okay. I would say that probably having kinds of experiences of wonder and amazement at an early stage in my life, I think that came first. And I think but I've always had a strong academic drive and a critical thinking, and I experienced, as probably many of us did here, a crashing of my world of faith when I was 18 years old and went off to college, right? And out of that rubble, right, I kind of found another a path that was, I felt, intellectually more honest but also emotionally honest. Part of the problem, and when things started my naive faith fell apart, is that which gave me among the greatest sipuk nefesh, the greatest fulfillment, I no longer believed was true. And so that just recalibrating that, finding different ways, finding lessons from some of the mystics and Buber and others was very, very, and having teachers along the way that I could talk this out with was incredibly important to me. And so when I went to, I thought I was going to be a rabbi. That fell apart. Then I figured, well, I am a spiritual being, but I'm going to study with Art Green, who in some ways melded together spiritual practice with an academic kind of approach. And I did throw myself into that. And I would say for a long time, it's not that I totally squelched my spiritual practice life, but I kept it a little bit sequestered, kept it under a bushel, and there would be settings where I would trot it out. And it took me till I was over like 40 to say that I have to fundamentally admit that I am a spiritual being, and that it's at the core. It's not just at the side. And how there's some things I can integrate. There's some things I'm not always integrating, right? Sometimes I'm trying out different practices. I am thankful for some elements of many elements of critical thinking. It has liberated me in some ways. I can understand the context of the biblical texts in a different kind of way. At the same time, I still feel like I want to I want to enter into the text in a different kind of way as well, as drawing on some of the tools of my ancestors and being open to new approaches as well. Reading the Torah after I've been sitting with Sylvia Boorstein for a week when I did that, for example, gave me new eyes, and that was extraordinary. In a nutshell.
Amen. Maybe we can close with a little bit, a moment of breath, and maybe you'd be willing to bring us back to the Nachman Dveikus Nigen.
Yes.
Perhaps give us a kavanah or a prompt for it.
So this time, I want to say I feel the presence of many people here. There's names I know and there's names I don't know. I want to say I am so grateful to everyone who has showed up here. I'm grateful to the Commonweal New School. I'm grateful to my chaver, my friend and teacher, and maybe student, Irwin. I'd like to dedicate the rest of this exercise just to everyone who's here, to our well-being. May blessing flow through us and into the world that so needs healing. May we find the inspiration we need, moments and practices of resilience amidst the brokenness. So let's just do a cleansing breath. And do another one. And this time, I invite us to send healing breath to everyone who is here, to be connected, to know that we are part of a great web of being, of a great mystery that is, I pray, slowly evolving to greater good, greater justice, greater awareness and love. So, deep breath. And out breath into each other and into the world. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 na, 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 Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 na. Ooh, 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 ooh. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 na. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 na, ya, na, 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 na. Ay, 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 na, yan, da, da. Yalla, titty, yalla, ya, 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 ya. Ay, 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 yanda, yanda, da. Ay, ay, ananda. V'nomar, amen.
Thank you, Reb Elliot. Always such a joy. And your joy is contagious. And a good Shabbos, a Shabbat Shalom, a Sabbath of peace to
Yeah.
you and to everyone in the room. A reminder that there are upcoming New School programs, and Kira put them into the chat, so if you scroll up, you'll find them, and you can also visit tns.commonweal.org. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Ken and Kira, for creating such a beautiful vessel for us.